What happens when a woman sees too much, knows too much, or speaks truths that the powerful cannot afford to hear? Imagine standing in a world where prophecy is both feared and desired, where a single prediction can shift the balance of kingdoms, yet the woman who speaks it becomes the target of the very empire she once served. Were these prophetesses exiled because they were dangerous, or because they revealed dangers others wanted buried? That question shapes every part of this forgotten chapter of ancient history, and the deeper you go, the more you realize how much was intentionally hidden. Across multiple civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Near East, women gifted with visions walked a razor edge between reverence and obliteration. Their insight into politics, warfare, disease, and divine will made them invaluable in times of crisis, but intolerable in times of control. The moment a prophecy contradicted a king, exposed a priesthood, or threatened a rising dynasty, the prophetess was no longer a sacred vessel. She became a liability. And liabilities were removed quickly, quietly, and without mercy. The official records always said the same thing: disobedience, impurity, hysteria. But what really happened to these women once the decree of exile was passed is far darker than the sanitized lines found in surviving tablets and scrolls. The banishment rarely happened in daylight. Most were taken during late hours, under the guise of ritual purification or spiritual reassessment. They were led to remote sanctuaries, abandoned shrines, border temples, or forest thresholds where scribes and judges waited with sealed orders. Some were forced to recant their visions, others to submit to interrogations disguised as divine tests. Many refused, knowing that to deny a vision was to kill a part of themselves, and yet that refusal often signed their final sentence. Their names were struck from temple records, their lineage erased, their disciples forbidden to speak of them. The most haunting detail is that almost every culture followed the same pattern, as if the suppression of these women was a shared instinct of empires desperate to control the narrative of the divine. What makes this even more unsettling is how coordinated the silence became. When a prophetess was banished, those who remained were ordered to perform cleansing rituals meant to symbolically sever her from the spiritual realm. The message was clear. She no longer belonged to the living world of prophecy. She was a shadow, a warning, an example. But the testimonies that survived, hidden in private letters, marginal notes, and oral traditions recorded centuries later, tell a different story. They speak of women who walked into exile with eyes open, not broken, carrying knowledge that rulers feared might outlast them. They hint at secret networks that protected the outcast, at coded prophecies carved onto stones near ancient borders, at strange phenomena that followed the disappearance of certain seers. And this is where the fear of the powerful becomes visible. If these prophetesses were truly destroyed, why erase them so aggressively? Why burn their prophecies? Why forbid daughters from learning the rituals their mothers once mastered? The answer lies in how dangerous uncontrolled truth can be in a world built on curated belief. These women were not exiled because they were mistaken. They were exiled because they were right at the wrong time. You have probably felt something like this before, that instinct that truth often threatens those who depend on silence. Have you ever wondered why certain stories disappear while others echo for centuries? If this opening is making you question what else was erased, stay with this journey and let your curiosity guide you. Before moving to the next part, share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you've ever felt that unsettling sense that some truths are pushed into the shadows. Leave your like to help this investigation reach more people, and check if you're already subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, as we continue uncovering what happened to these women after their disappearance, following the trail they left behind even when the world tried to bury it. Once a prophetess was marked as a threat, the process that followed was not chaotic or impulsive. It was systematic, calculated and refined across generations of rulers who understood that controlling the spiritual narrative was just as essential as controlling armies. Empires developed quiet mechanisms to identify women whose visions carried influence, long before any public decree or accusation was made. These mechanisms varied from region to region, but the intention was always the same: to categorize, observe, and eventually neutralize those whose voices reached too far into matters of power. It often began in childhood. Girls who displayed unusual intuition, who predicted storms, illnesses, or political shifts, were quietly noted by temple attendants and scribes. Their families sometimes misunderstood the attention as respect or divine interest, unaware that the empire kept lists of potential threats long before these girls even understood what their visions meant. By adolescence, their reputations traveled faster than they did. Priests, magistrates, or royal advisors sent discreet observers to record their behavior, rituals, and accuracy. A young woman who foresaw a famine might receive praise publicly while being classified privately as volatile or dangerous if her predictions challenged the decisions of high-ranking officials. As they grew older, the classification systems became more formal. Some empires used sealed scrolls that categorized prophetesses into 3 ranks based on political usefulness: sanctioned, conditional, and forbidden. A sanctioned prophetess served the state directly, her visions interpreted only through official channels. A conditional prophetess was tolerated but monitored closely, restricted to minor temples or remote shrines where her influence remained contained. But the forbidden category carried a silent sentence. These were women whose visions contradicted royal decrees, undermined military campaigns, exposed corruption, or predicted events the ruling elite wanted concealed. The moment a prophetess entered this category, her fate was already sealed regardless of her innocence. The hunt rarely resembled the dramatic scenes imagined today. There were no mobs or torches, no chaotic arrests. Instead, the process unfolded with eerie precision. Temple guards arrived under the guise of escorting her for counsel. Scribes carried pre-written accusations disguised as ritual assessments. Physicians performed invasive examinations to label visions as illness or instability, knowing their words would justify the exile. And in courts or temples where she once stood as a respected figure, officials quietly recorded their decisions in coded language that allowed the empire to deny responsibility. Terms like spiritual imbalance, doctrinal deviation, or unaligned prophecy hid the true motives behind her removal. Even more disturbing were the informants embedded in spiritual communities. Some were junior priestesses promised advancement if they reported unusual behavior. Others were coerced by threats against their families. These informants recorded details about a prophetess's private rituals, emotional vulnerabilities, and even her dreams. Empires understood that to dismantle a prophetess's authority, they first had to dismantle the belief in her purity, stability, or divine connection. Rumors were planted strategically, suggesting she practiced forbidden rites or had been touched by dangerous spirits. Once her reputation was weakened, removing her became a matter of procedure rather than conflict. But the most haunting element of this system was how often it succeeded without resistance. Many prophetesses had never imagined themselves as political figures. Their role was to interpret signs, not to navigate the ambitions of men who feared those signs. When authorities arrived, some believed they were being taken for sacred consultation. Others believed their exile would be temporary, a cleansing period after which they would return. Almost none realized that the system designed to classify them had already decided their disappearance long before the first accusation was spoken aloud. And yet, despite all the careful strategies and silent mechanisms, the echoes of these women persisted in fragmented oral traditions, in cryptic carvings near abandoned shrines, in marginal notes scribes accidentally preserved while copying official records. These traces revealed just how deeply their existence had unsettled empires that relied on curated truth, and how much effort was invested into ensuring their voices never reached the world again as the path toward their banishment grew, darker and far more deliberate than anyone dared to admit. By the time a prophetess reached the final stage of condemnation, the empire no longer needed loud accusations or public ceremonies. Everything unfolded within restricted chambers, hidden altars, and twilight rituals designed to mask political decisions beneath layers of spiritual symbolism. The ritual of expulsion was not simply a punishment. It was a choreographed process meant to sever her from the community, from the divine, and even from her own identity. Every step served a purpose, and none of it was designed to be remembered. The proceedings usually began in what officials called the Hall of Purification, though nothing about it offered cleansing or mercy. Torches burned low to distort the light, inscriptions covered the walls in languages only the priesthood could read, and a single stone platform stood at the center. The prophetess was ordered to stand barefoot upon it, a symbolic gesture that declared she carried no sacred authority of her own. Around her, judges chosen by royal decree waited with tablets already prepared long before she entered the room. Their verdicts were not the result of investigation, but the culmination of a system that had quietly marked her as unwanted months or even years earlier. The interrogation phase was deliberately disorienting. She was asked about visions she had shared, then accused of predicting events she had never spoken of, then confronted with misinterpretations planted intentionally in the community. Officials watched closely not to seek truth, but to document emotional responses they could classify as instability. The more calmly she defended herself, the more they insisted she was hiding dangerous knowledge. The more passionately she spoke, the more they claimed she was unfit for divine service. Every answer became a reason to proceed with the expulsion, proving that the ritual existed only to justify a sentence that had already been decided in silence. While the judges questioned her, scribes recorded every moment in coded phrases meant to distort the truth. If she raised her voice, it became evidence of corruption. If she remained quiet, she was written as deceitful. Even acts of mercy were turned against her. Some prophetesses tried to warn their interrogators of visions they had seen concerning the kingdom, but these warnings were noted as threats rather than prophecy. In a world where political control depended on shaping the divine narrative, a woman who spoke truths inconvenient to power could not be allowed to keep her voice. The ritual itself began when the chief priest signaled a group of attendants to circle the platform. They carried bowls of blessed ash, dyed water, or crushed herbs believed to neutralize spiritual influence. One by one, they sprinkled or smeared these substances around the prophetess, forming a symbolic boundary that declared her separated from the sacred realm. Though the gesture appeared ceremonial, its purpose was psychological. It allowed the empire to claim that the exile was spiritual necessity, not political elimination. Once the boundary was completed, the priest recited a litany in a slow, rhythmic chant. Outsiders believed this chant severed the prophetess from divine communion, but hidden texts suggest it was actually a vow of silence among officials, binding them never to reveal the real reasons behind her disappearance. At the end of the chant, the judges pressed their seals onto the tablets, finalizing the verdict with chilling efficiency. The prophetess, still unaware of where she would be taken or what awaited her beyond the temple walls, was escorted away by guards who avoided eye contact, as if looking at her might acknowledge the injustice of the moment. To the public, she was said to have entered a period of spiritual retreat or correction. No one was told that she would never return, and for those who searched for answers, only fragments remained. A missing inscription here, a damaged statue there, a space left blank on the record of temple servants. These absences reveal more than the official archives ever intended. They show how thoroughly the system erased these women, not only from their roles, but from memory itself, as if removing their presence from history was just another part of the ritual. Yet the process did not end with the verdict. Beyond the temple walls, a darker journey awaited, shaped by forces that saw exile not as the final punishment, but as the beginning of something even more controlled and far more dangerous. A journey where silence became a weapon and disappearance became a tool of absolute power. Once the ritual of expulsion stripped a prophetess of her title, her identity, and her place among the living, the empire ensured that her disappearance unfolded far from the eyes of those who might question it. Exile was not a single destination, but a network of routes chosen carefully to guarantee silence. Each path carried a different kind of danger, shaped not by nature alone, but by the intention of those who designed the journey. These routes were selected because they left no trace, no witnesses, no burial markers, and no reason for anyone to search. Some prophetesses were taken to dense forests where sunlight barely reached the ground. These were not ordinary woodlands, but border zones between kingdoms, filled with abandoned shrines, rotting altars, and relics of older cults that had long since been condemned. The guards who escorted them rarely ventured far into these woods. They released the prophetess at the threshold and watched her disappear between the trees, knowing the forest itself carried tales of predators, spirits, and travelers who never returned. Temple manuscripts suggest these locations were chosen because the forests were believed to distort perception, blurring the line between divine visions and hallucinations, making anything she might experience impossible to verify. Others were forced into deserts where no water flowed and no shade offered respite. These deserts were used not simply for isolation, but for erasure. A prophetess walking through endless dunes left no footprints the wind would not swallow by morning. Caravans rarely crossed these areas, and even nomads avoided them out of superstition. The empire benefited from the desert's silence. If she perished there, the sand became both grave and witness, holding no memory of the body it consumed. What made these exiles even more haunting was the fact that some prophetesses were sent with small offerings of food or water, as if the empire wanted to pretend it offered mercy, while knowing perfectly well that survival was only a temporary illusion. Then there were the mountains, the most feared of all the exile destinations. These were jagged, wind-scoured peaks with paths too narrow for horses and too treacherous for travelers. According to fragmented records, mountain exiles were reserved for prophetesses considered particularly dangerous, not because of the content of their visions, but because of the loyalty they inspired. Sending them into high, isolated terrain ensured that even if followers attempted rescue, they would face deadly terrain long before reaching them. Some ancient texts describe strange symbols carved into cliff faces, suggesting that prophetesses left behind messages or warnings, though scholars disagree on whether these markings were genuine prophecies or later embellishments added by fearful devotees. What all these paths shared was the empire's intention: remove the prophetess from the world without shedding blood publicly, without inciting sympathy, without creating a martyr. Officially, the authorities claimed they were sent to places conducive to reflection and purification. Unofficially, the routes were engineered so that even if a prophetess survived the first night, she would not survive the journey as a whole. And yet, whispers persisted. Stories of women who walked into forests and emerged weeks later with visions sharper than before. Rumors of exiles who found refuge with hidden tribes, hermits, or outlawed spiritual groups. Tales of prophetesses whose disappearance was followed by unexplained storms, plagues, or political upheavals, as if the land itself reacted to their unjust removal. These stories, however, true or exaggerated, did not change the empire's methods. The paths of exile remained a key, silent weapon, one that left no record, no body, and no voice capable of revealing what truly happened once the guards' footsteps faded behind them. And the most unsettling part is how consistently these patterns appear across empires that never contacted one another, as if the decision to hide these women in the most remote corners of the world was an instinct shared by rulers who feared both the divine and the truth that accompanied it. Before we continue, I would truly like to hear your thoughts. What do you imagine happened to these women after they were led into the unknown? Leave a comment sharing your interpretation or feeling about this moment in the story, and let your voice be part of uncovering what history tried so hard to hide. For the prophetesses who survived the initial stages of exile or were intercepted before reaching the wilderness, a different fate awaited. Not every empire chose disappearance as the final step. Some rulers understood that spiritual authority, once stripped from its original purpose, could be repurposed into something far more useful to those in power. These prophetesses were not simply removed, they were reshaped, their gifts redirected, disciplined, and weaponized. What emerged was a system in which spiritual insight became a tool of political engineering, and the women who once served the divine were forced to serve agendas that contradicted everything their visions had revealed. This transformation began long before exile was mentioned. Hidden within the archives of major temples were specialized chambers used not for worship, but for re-education. These chambers were designed to erode confidence, distort intuition, and reframe visions so thoroughly that a prophetess questioned her own perceptions. Officials believed that if they could hollow out her certainty, they could rebuild her with a new framework aligned with the empire's needs. The process involved sensory deprivation, forced isolation, and ritual, repetition, blurring the line between spiritual discipline and psychological manipulation. One of the most insidious techniques involved binding a prophetess to a controlled environment, where every sound, scent, and light was curated. The purpose was simple: to disconnect her from natural cues that shaped authentic visions. Instead, priests whispered state-approved interpretations, embedding political objectives within symbolic language. Over time, some prophetesses began to confuse their coerced visions with genuine ones, not because they were weak, but because the empire had learned to mimic the rhythms and patterns of prophecy with disturbing accuracy. This was not faith, it was conditioning. Another method focused on exploiting fear and loyalty simultaneously. Prophetesses were shown carefully staged omens, false signs crafted by illusionists, astrologers, or state scholars. The empire wanted them to believe that the universe itself endorsed the ruler's decisions. When a prophetess resisted, the consequences were swift. She was confronted with threats against loved ones, or forced to witness the punishment of others accused of questioning divine order. These emotional pressures were chosen deliberately because spiritual women relied heavily on empathy, making them more vulnerable to harm inflicted upon those they cared about. In some temples, the process became even darker. Records hint at forbidden substances administered under the guise of ritual, purification. These mixtures induced hallucinations that blurred the boundary between real vision and manufactured revelation. A prophetess caught in this web often believed she was failing her divine calling, unaware that the empire had designed the very confusion tormenting her. The objective was clear: break the spiritual structure of her identity and rebuild it using fear, isolation, and calculated deceit. Once the transformation was deemed complete, the prophetess was introduced into the political hierarchy not as a spiritual guide, but as a symbol. She became a mouthpiece for royal decrees, a performer in ceremonies meant to legitimize conquests, economic reforms, or succession disputes. Her presence was meant to imply divine approval where none existed. The tragedy lies not only in the manipulation itself, but in how effectively the empire concealed it. Citizens believed these women still spoke for the divine, unaware that every word had been shaped, rehearsed, or dictated by men behind hidden screens. Yet despite all this, remnants of resistance appeared in subtle ways. A strange pause during a public prophecy, a symbol drawn incorrectly on purpose, a cryptic phrase embedded in an otherwise compliant declaration. These small acts suggest that even after intense coercion, some prophetesses retained fragments of their original vision. They attempted to encode warnings, hints, or contradictions within the very rituals meant to silence them. These whispers of defiance survived in secret commentaries, marginal notes left by sympathetic scribes, and oral traditions passed quietly between generations of women. These fragments reveal that transformation was never truly complete. The gift of prophecy, though suppressed, could not be extinguished entirely. And the more the empire tried to bend these women into instruments of control, the more unpredictable the consequences became, setting the stage for the hidden networks and shadowed alliances that emerged among those who refused to let their voices vanish into the machinery of power. While empires officially claimed that prophetesses were exiled, purified, or reassigned to distant sanctuaries, the hidden truth is far more disturbing. Many of these women never reached the forests, deserts, or mountains described in public decrees. Instead, they were intercepted by clandestine networks operating in the shadows of the political and spiritual system. These groups, often composed of corrupt priests, opportunistic merchants, and rogue officials, recognize the immense value of a woman with prophetic ability. They transformed exile into an underground economy, one where the fate of a prophetess was determined not by divine will, but by the highest bidder. These networks thrived in border regions where the authority of central governments weakened and where ancient trade routes created endless opportunities for secrecy. Hidden compounds were established near caravan stations, mountain passes, or abandoned temples. In these places, prophetesses were stripped of their names, their garments, and any symbols connecting them to their former roles. Identity erasure was the first step, ensuring that no follower, no disciple, no curious official could trace them. To the outside world, they had vanished. To their captors, they had become assets. Some prophetesses were forced into roles that twisted their abilities into services for warlords, smugglers, or wealthy patrons seeking advantage. Their visions were demanded not as spiritual guidance but as commodities. A single prediction about an upcoming famine, political shift, or enemy ambush could be traded for enormous wealth. This exploitation created a grim irony. The same prophetic insight that brought them honor in temples now became the reason for their captivity in underground markets. The more accurate their visions, the more tightly they were controlled. Other prophetesses faced even darker uses. Certain factions within. These networks believed that extracting spiritual energy could enhance rituals, charms, or forbidden rites. Though the historical evidence is fragmented, scattered documents speak of ceremonies where prophetesses were forced to enter trance states repeatedly until their senses broke. These rituals did not seek guidance from the divine. They sought power from exhaustion, confusion, or fear. Such practices reveal a world where the sacred was corrupted into a tool of domination, and where the spiritual suffering of these women became part of the machinery sustaining criminal and political interests. Some prophetesses resisted silently. They offered vague predictions, created false symbols, or intentionally misinterpreted omens to sabotage their captors. In response, the networks developed psychological tactics to force compliance. They fabricated visions using illusions, sound manipulation, or drug-induced states designed to convince a prophetess that her resistance endangered others. This emotional warfare made it extremely difficult for even the strongest individuals to distinguish their true visions from the ones engineered to break them. Over time, these networks expanded, forming communication chains that stretched across continents. They exchanged coded messages disguised as merchant inventories or temple offerings, allowing the movement of prophetesses to remain undetected even by powerful empires. Such coordination implies that these underground groups shared a common understanding that controlling prophecy meant controlling fear, belief, and the future itself. And for those who mastered that control, the boundaries between criminal influence and political authority grew dangerously thin. Yet, despite the cruelty of these networks, small acts of compassion persisted. Some guards secretly helped prophetesses escape, leaving clues or directions hidden in supply crates. Certain merchants offered them refuge disguised as travelers. Former acolytes who suspected the truth followed rumors across distant regions, searching for mentors they refused to believe were dead. These stories, though rare, reveal that the disappearance of prophetesses was not always absolute. Even in the darkest corners of exploitation, there were flickers of loyalty, memory, and hope. But the system as a whole remained relentless. To ensure silence, the networks often falsified death reports, burned identifying documents, and replaced captured prophetesses with fabricated accounts of their banishment. This not only protected the traffickers but also reinforced the official narrative, making it nearly impossible for anyone to uncover the truth. And so the names of countless women were lost, their lives absorbed into a hidden marketplace built on fear, secrecy, and spiritual manipulation, setting the stage for the strange reappearances and unexplained events that would soon trouble the empires that believed they had erased them forever. Even after prophetesses were erased from official records and hidden away by clandestine networks, their presence persisted in subtle, inexplicable ways. Accounts from scribes, travelers, and local villagers describe phenomena that could not be explained by ordinary natural causes. Sudden storms over abandoned temples, rivers swelling without warning, or crops failing precisely when political decisions ignored sacred counsel, were all interpreted as signs of the prophetess's unseen influence. While empires dismissed these events as coincidences, insiders quietly recorded them, recognizing a pattern of quiet resistance that no human force could completely suppress. Some of the most compelling reports describe visions or messages delivered through animals, flames, or wind. Letters and diaries uncovered centuries later tell of birds appearing in formation over exile paths, carrying small markings on their feathers, or of fires spontaneously erupting in shrines where a prophetess had been confined. Scribes referred to these events using coded language, suggesting an understanding that these were not random occurrences, but deliberate acts of spiritual persistence. To those trained in interpreting omens, the messages were unmistakable. The women had not been silenced. Their power was reasserting itself, even from afar. The silent vengeance extended to the networks that had exploited and confined them. Guards who had participated in transporting prophetesses reported strange nightmares, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable accidents. Officials tasked with monitoring exiles sometimes found their correspondence mysteriously altered or lost, and cryptic symbols appeared in margins of previously clean manuscripts. Chroniclers, often fearful of retaliation, hid these observations in secret codices or encoded them in poetry. The empire may have believed it had control over the prophetess's fates, yet their influence seeped into every corner of the state apparatus, unsettling rulers who had assumed total dominion. Remarkably, some prophetesses found ways to communicate directly with one another, using subtle gestures, hidden marks, or coded messages left in abandoned temples or along exile routes. These clandestine connections allowed them to share warnings, preserve knowledge, and maintain a sense of spiritual community despite physical separation. Their networks became living testimonies to resilience, ensuring that the knowledge and foresight they carried would not be entirely extinguished, even when history tried to erase it. This invisible resistance also affected the common people. Villagers who encountered an exile often reported sudden inspirations, warnings in dreams, or inexplicable survival during attacks or disasters. Over time, oral traditions incorporated these stories, embedding the prophetess's presence into myths, legends, and local rituals. While the ruling elite attempted to suppress any trace of their influence, these phenomena created a persistent echo, a reminder that the women's power could not be fully contained. Even the most rigid empires eventually recognized the limits of their control. When chroniclers noted repeated anomalies, unexplained omens, or subtle disruptions in administrative procedures, they often attributed them to divine displeasure or supernatural forces, never daring to trace the source back to the banished prophetesses. It is this ongoing impact that history largely conceals, revealing how these women, erased in body and name, continued to shape events and unsettle the structures that sought to suppress them. I want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think these unexplained phenomena tell us about the women who were banished? Leave a comment sharing your interpretation or your reaction to the idea that even erased prophetesses could influence events from the shadows, and join the conversation about these hidden forces that history almost forgot. The effort to erase the prophetesses extended far beyond exile and clandestine networks. Empires undertook systematic destruction of the very records that could have preserved their stories. Libraries were purged of writings that mentioned their names, shrines were dismantled or repurposed, and inscriptions that once celebrated their insight were defaced or buried. The aim was not simply to remove living witnesses, but to control memory itself, ensuring that future generations would never learn the truth. By destroying evidence, rulers attempted to rewrite history, erasing the existence of women whose spiritual influence had once been undeniable. Burning archives became a common practice in cities where prophetesses had served publicly. Scrolls containing accounts of visions, omens, and ritual proceedings were fed to flames. Scribes who refused to comply often disappeared, their manuscripts lost or hidden away in private collections that would only surface centuries later. In cases where physical destruction was not possible, erasure was performed symbolically. Ink was scraped off pages, words overwritten, and names replaced with neutral or state-approved figures. The cumulative effect was to create a historical vacuum where the actions of these women could no longer be verified by conventional means. Temples and sacred sites played a crucial role in this concealment. Shrines that had once been associated with prophetic activity were either abandoned or repurposed for state. Rituals. Stones engraved with visions or warnings were removed and scattered, sometimes used as building materials in new constructions, literally embedding the memory of the prophetesses into structures where it could no longer be recognized. Even the local population was conditioned to forget. Festivals, prayers, and commemorations tied to these women were forbidden or replaced with state-sanctioned celebrations, ensuring that oral tradition was overwritten as well. Despite these efforts, fragments survived in unexpected ways. Marginal notes by defiant scribes, letters hidden in private estates, and coded carvings in remote temples preserved glimpses of the prophetesses' lives and influence. In some cases, manuscripts were copied secretly and transported across regions, creating shadow archives that chronicled exile routes, warnings, and predictions. These hidden documents reveal a deliberate attempt by some insiders to preserve truth even under threat of punishment, demonstrating that complete erasure was impossible. The women's impact persisted, quietly resisting suppression through the subtlety of memory, devotion, and encoded communication. Even centuries later, archaeologists and historians uncover these traces, piecing together patterns that official records deliberately omitted. They find evidence of sudden structural alterations in temples, traces of burned papyrus beneath floors, and fragments of letters that contradict sanctioned histories. Each discovery highlights the extraordinary lengths empires went to conceal the existence of these prophetesses, and yet each fragment also underscores the resilience of their presence. The systematic destruction of archives and sacred spaces was intended to guarantee oblivion, but it also unintentionally created a trail of anomalies that continue to intrigue researchers and challenge accepted narratives. The hidden testimonies often reveal the human cost of this erasure. witnesses who survived. Exile, whether scribes, disciples, or members of local communities, carried stories that had to be whispered, encoded, or transmitted in riddles. Generations of these oral traditions preserved details that official histories obliterated. The result is a fragmented yet persistent echo of the prophetess's influence, showing that even in the face of state-sanctioned destruction, memory and truth can endure. These fragments form the foundation of what we now begin to reconstruct: a history, deliberately obscured, yet impossible to fully extinguish. As centuries passed, the surviving prophetesses faced a world increasingly hostile to their existence. The final generation grew up with the memories of those who had vanished before them, hearing fragments of warnings and tales that no longer carried the weight they once held. These women were born into exile or raised under the shadow of imperial scrutiny, often without access to formal training or spiritual communities that had once nurtured their abilities. The isolation imposed on them was not merely physical. It extended into culture, memory, and language, creating an environment where even extraordinary insight was regarded with suspicion. This generation encountered societies that had systematically reinterpreted prophecy as delusion. What had once been considered divine foresight was now labeled hysteria, madness, or superstition. Any public display of knowledge or spiritual skill was met with skepticism, ridicule, or persecution. In courts where once a prophetess's word might have influenced military strategy, legislation, or succession, her insights were dismissed as erratic or dangerous eccentricities. The repetition of this pattern ensured that the power of prophecy was not only contained but delegitimized, severing the link between spiritual authority and societal influence. The reinterpretation of signs and visions also served to reinforce state narratives. Texts that survived the earlier destruction of archives were carefully edited, marginal notes were removed, and oral traditions were twisted into cautionary tales warning against female hubris. A storm once interpreted as divine retribution might now be described as coincidental misfortune, a sudden illness as natural disease rather than a manifestation of unseen forces. Communities that had relied on the counsel of prophetesses were conditioned to view intuition with doubt, turning those who retained gifts into anomalies, social outcasts, or targets of official investigation. Yet, even under these conditions, the prophetesses continued to leave traces of their insight. Secret gatherings in hidden locations, encoded markings on objects, and subtle gestures in public spaces became methods of transmitting knowledge safely. Disciples, family members, and sympathetic citizens preserved fragments of ritual, prophecy, and warning in whispers, graffiti, and carefully concealed manuscripts. These acts were dangerous. Discovery often meant imprisonment, exile, or worse. The very act of survival required adapting spiritual practice into forms that could persist unnoticed, leaving a legacy both invisible and persistent. Despite reinterpretation and suppression, some signs retained their potency. Communities occasionally reported inexplicable events aligned with the prophecies of these women: unseasonal weather, sudden plagues, or the rise and fall of leaders in patterns that matched ancient predictions. Scholars centuries later found inconsistencies in official histories, revealing that what had been dismissed as madness often contained a kernel of undeniable truth. These contradictions suggest that even as the last generation of prophetesses was systematically marginalized, their influence continued to ripple through societies, a quiet defiance embedded in the fabric of memory. The story of this generation highlights the tension between institutional control and spiritual autonomy. While empires and rulers attempted to redefine prophecy as insanity, the prophetess's endurance demonstrated that suppression could never fully eradicate insight. Their lives became a study in resilience, showing that even when the world sought to erase knowledge, vision could survive in shadowed corners, transmitted carefully to those willing to see beyond the sanctioned narrative. The banished women left traces, subtle yet powerful, reminding all who dared to notice that truth cannot be entirely hidden, and that history itself is often rewritten to obscure what it fears most. The cumulative impact of centuries of exile, suppression, and reinterpretation left a legacy that is as chilling as it is instructive. The erased prophetesses, whose lives were meticulously hidden from official history, reveal the extraordinary lengths to which empires would go to control knowledge, manipulate belief, and shape human behavior. Each disappearance, each act of erasure, was not random. It was part of a calculated strategy designed to ensure that certain truths, often inconvenient, often threatening to power, remained unseen, unspoken, and unacknowledged. Their stories, pieced together through fragments of oral tradition, coded messages, and marginal notes, expose an unbroken line of women whose insight was feared more than respected, whose voices could unsettle empires even after being silenced. Over time, historians, archaeologists, and scholars have begun to uncover the magnitude of these hidden truths. Manuscripts recovered from private collections, fragments of destroyed archives, and anomalies recorded in temples hint at an organized effort to erase memory itself. The prophetesses were more than women with foresight. They were symbols of resistance against the monopolization of truth. Even as their names were struck from records, their influence persisted in subtle phenomena, the unexplained, the prophetic, the inexplicable events that ordinary explanations could not fully account for. It is this hidden persistence that offers the most profound lesson. Power seeks to dominate not only the present but the past, and controlling memory is as potent as controlling armies. The ultimate revelation is that the fate of these women was deliberately obscured, not merely to remove them physically, but to prevent societies from acknowledging their authority and the validity of their knowledge. By recasting visions as hysteria, by erasing texts, and by rewriting narratives, empires sought to replace divine or intuitive insight with state-sanctioned doctrine. Yet, paradoxically, the very efforts to obliterate them created enduring intrigue. Their absences, the anomalies left behind, and the whispers of defiance ensured that curiosity about their fates would continue, compelling later generations to question what had been hidden and why. Today, the dark legacy of the banished prophetesses challenges our understanding of history. It forces us to consider what else might have been erased, how many truths were buried beneath layers of official narratives, and how power can distort memory for centuries. Their stories illuminate the tension between authority and insight, between control and freedom, and remind us that even the most comprehensive attempts at erasure cannot fully suppress the human drive to seek truth and justice. Every fragment recovered, every whisper passed down, demonstrates that visibility is not the same as existence, and that influence can persist in ways that defy conventional measures of power. If you have stayed with this story until now, consider what it means to witness truths that history tried to erase. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," or share how this story resonates with you. Hit the like button to support uncovering hidden histories, and make sure you're subscribed to continue exploring these remarkable narratives. There is another story waiting to reveal even deeper secrets, and following it, we'll extend the journey into the shadows where history was rewritten, but insight and courage endure.